Hi, it's Sandra from SandraD Imagery, and I'm going to share with you how I created this image, which I've titled Autumn. It's what I call a fun image, and by that I mean I let the imagination roam and take me wherever it went. When I looked at the image, I thought, what can I do with the colour grading? Can I add any other elements to it? And that's where it just evolved as I was playing. Let's dive in and let's see where my imagination goes on creating autumn. This was the base image that I started with, generated with AI, and what I had in mind was to create a woman with autumn tones and colouring, and very much like a Medusa with the branches coming out of their head. And this is the result that I got. As soon as I saw it, I loved the colours and the tones, and I thought, I can play with this and let's see where I can go with it. But I also knew that there was not enough, to my eye, negative space on both sides and at the top. So I did this early in my workflow. I extended it using the crop tool, but I wasn't sure what elements I was going to put in it, so I held off doing the generative expand to fill in those transparent pixels. But as I started to look at the image a little bit more closer, I noticed there were birds in the branches, and I thought, oh, that sparks an idea. Let's go to the stash and see what I've got that I could actually add into those branches. I had different ideas. I thought, do I add more birds? Do I put a bird's nest in there? What else can I do? But I found these birds, and I think they just work so great with the branches. I'll turn the first bird layer on, and there it is. I'll turn it off and on. And I love these quirky birds. They've been sitting in the stash just waiting for the right moment to come out. I found another bird and I put that in, and I just tried to work on balance. And again, it's about the triangle composition and getting that balance where I place the elements. I'll add another bird in and I'll turn that layer on and off. And you can see now they're just sitting like an arc around her head in the branches, and I was happy with that. I didn't think it needed any more birds in there. I wanted to work on a very simple composition. Now I started to look at it and I thought, it looks boring or bland in the background. Even though I love the colours, it gives no context where she's actually sitting or standing. So the next layer I chose was to put a forest in the background. And this background is from my shop in Magical Forest collection. I'll turn the layer on, and you can see now it's given that depth of the image with these trees. I'm going to have a look at the actual blend mode, and you can see it's in darken. I'll change it to normal, and then I'll change the opacity to 100%, and you can actually see that's what that background looks like. But using different blend modes and different opacities can give a different look. And the reason that I did that is I didn't want the forest background to be dominant. If you look at the masking, I had to do some workarounds, and so that I could dial down the opacity, but I had to mask off around the head just up here so that I could get those branches coming through. Again, it's about the workarounds and knowing your basic tools and understanding what masks do, what blend modes do, etc. I sat back now and looked, and I thought, am I happy with the colouring? And one of my colour grading techniques is what I call colour average. And this is one that I let Photoshop do the grunt work for me. And you can see here with this layer, it's a green. I'm going to turn that layer on, and now what it's done is given a little bit more depth. Let's come up to the blend mode, and it's multiply, and the opacity is sitting roughly around about 45. And the reason that I've done this in my workflow is that I combined two images, the woman and then the background, the forest. And by putting those two together and using this technique, it blends the colors and the tones and makes it uniform. The combination of using a blend mode and dialing down your opacity can either make it softer in its colors or stronger if you want. For example, you leave the opacity at 100%. But I wanted to make the background, the forest, soft and receding because it's not the main player in the composition, it's the woman in the foreground. To access this technique, what you'll do is go to Filter, go to Blur, and then Average. And what will happen then is Photoshop works out the average colors and will come up with that layer. And that will vary on any image. It could change to a blue, it could change to a grey. Just depends what the colors are in your image. You can also see now that I've done some masking. And the reason that I applied a mask was this green came over her face and changed the skin tones. So I added a mask, and you can see that I've actually brushed off that green in the dress, the hair, the branches, and particularly on the face. And that's something that I'll do or be conscious of, that if I'm using this technique, I don't want it on all of the image. I may only want it on some of the image. The next layer is what I call a stamp visible layer. I'll turn that on. And the reason that I do that is I'm stopping, looking and seeing, do I need to add any more elements? What can I do with this? And I was happy with this. It was a simple composition. And to me, it's the beautiful woman in the foreground and those trees in the background that tell the story. So my next layer is where I've done generative expand and I've extended the canvas. I'll click on that layer and you can see now it's filled in that negative space. Now I look at the image and I'm generally happy with it. The composition, I feel that she frames or fills the frame with her front and center. There's context and depth with that forest background. Now I'm on to what I call the finishing touches. And the next technique that I use is, because when you're working with AI generated images, and particularly when you're dealing with faces, both of adults or children, there's a lack of skin texture. It's got like a plastic look to it. So one of the techniques that I use is a texturizer layer, and I use the filter gallery within Photoshop. I'm going to turn the next layer on, and then you'll see as we zoom in, there's a little bit of texture just in that image. I'll turn that layer off and on. It's very subtle, but if I look at the opacity, it's at 37%. If I dial that up to 100%, it's got a lot more of a texture feel, and I didn't want that. So I'm going to get it back to 37, and now this is the technique that I use. I come up to Filter, Filter Gallery, and in here there's a number of techniques that you can use. You can see there's the texture now that it's zoomed up. But let's have a look at the panel here. You've got choices artistic. If I click on that triangle, there's film grain, there's fresco. I encourage you to play with these and see what techniques and looks that you can create. Let's go and have a look at distort or texture, and the one that I've chosen is texture, and I've chosen texturizer. Over on the panel, the texture I've chosen is sandstone. You can play with the scaling, the light, invert. I don't tend to play around with these sliders too much. I just generally leave it as is, but then I'll play with the opacity. I'm going to click on cancel because I don't want to apply that technique. And that's how I get that texturizer in on her skin tones. The next layer is where I'm not too sure with the colours, so I'm going to go into Nik plugin and use the Viveza. Now I've chosen Fill Light, and I feel it's given it a bit too much lightness. Needs a little bit more depth to my eye. My next layer is a Levels Adjustment layer. I'll turn that on and off. So you can see now it's got a little bit more depth in those colours. The next layer is a Hue and Saturation Adjustment layer. I'll turn that layer on. And let's have a look at the properties and see what I've actually done. Saturation is -25. Lightness is +5. It's not a formula. It's just about playing with the sliders to see what speaks to your eye and the colours that you're after. I'll turn the properties off, but what you can see here is I've done a mask, and the reason that I've done some masking is that when I desaturated that image globally, it dialed down the depth of colours in the dress, in the hair, and also on the branches. So what I've done is I've, on the mask, got my brush tool, I've then brushed off that hue and saturation on those areas because I felt it was just lacking a little bit more depth. If I disable the mask, let's have a look. It's very subtle, but I just wanted to bring a little bit more depth, and that's why I use that mask. I'll turn the mask back on. My next layer is, I'll turn that on and off, and have a look at the distractors that I've got rid of down here in the bottom of the screen. I felt they didn't enhance the image, and I'll turn that layer on, and so I got rid of them. I'll often do what I call border control. Look around the edges, see what is a distractor. Is there anything that I need to remove? As I'm coming up through the layer stack now, I'm thinking it lacks light, or what I call dabs of light or sculpting light. This layer now is a grey layer where I've done some dodging. I'll turn the layer on and off. And what I've done is on a grey layer, use my paintbrush. I've made sure that the colour's white. I'll adjust the opacity, and I've just go around and dab light into areas that I want. Turn that layer off and turn it on. And you can actually see that I've dabbed light in the eyes. I've dabbed some light through her hair to give the illusion of like highlights that are coming through her hair. I've also felt that the birds were a little bit too dark for me, so I did a little bit what I call dodging, quick and dirty on that. The next layer I'll turn on, and this is where a stamp visible layer. I look, am I happy with it? Yes, I am, but I'm going to add one more layer just to give a little bit more of a finishing touch to the tones. Let's go up to this layer here. It's where I went into Nik and I use Viveza. I'll turn that layer on, and it's just subtly given a little bit more tonal depth, and I use the tonal adjustment. It's my finishing touch. Let's do a quick recap on different layers and techniques that I used to create autumn. This was the base layer. I've extended the canvas to give it a little bit more negative space. This is where I started to build up the birds and add into the branches. And as I've gone through, I've looked at it and I thought, I need some depth in that background. As much as I love the colours, it just didn't give any context. So the next layer is where I added another AI generated background, and that's in my shop under Magical Forest. I turn that on. Now we've got some context. The next layer, colour average to give some depth into the colour of the background. Stamp visible layer. I've extended the canvas. That builds up the negative space and gives more breathing room. I've added a texturizer layer so I can add some texture into the skin tone. Another Viveza layer just to give it a pop. It was tonal adjustment. levels just to get a little bit more depth in the midtones, hue and saturation where I've actually desaturated. I've also masked the saturation to come through on the dress, the face and the hair. Another stamp visible layer. Stop, look, think, is there anything else I need to do? I sculpted in some light with dodging on a grey layer. Then I've done a stamp visible layer, and the finishing touch was the vase just to give a little bit more tone. And there is Autumn. She was fun to create, and I love letting my imagination roam, take me wherever it goes, and playing with colour.